We're going to start today with the words of Moses, the Torah. The last of the book of Moses in the Torah is called Deuteronomy, in which Moses summarizes at the end of his life that which the people are always going to need to know in order to live by the faith of the Torah and do the work of God. Now, the essence of Deuteronomy is a whole section called the HaTorah Hazeh, this Torah. That begins in chapter 4, verse 44, and extends all the way through to chapter 28. It is the section that is said in Deuteronomy 30 to have been written by Moses and deposited in the Ark of the Covenant, protected by the priests, and read once every 7 years, because this is what they needed to know. Now, I want us to observe how it begins and how it ends, and Wendy has already quoted the appropriate words for us in this service. You shall love the Lord your God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your desire, and with all your money. I will come to defend that translation in due course, but that is the way in which this whole section begins, and it is the way in which the introduction of it ends here in chapters 9 through 11. Chapter 9 begins with, Hear, O Israel, and here in chapter 10 we have the words, What does the Lord require from you but to fear him and to love him with all your mind and all your desire? Now, the book of Deuteronomy uses the word fear many, many times as the call to faith. And it repeatedly has the call to love. But this is the only passage in which the two are brought together as this conclusion to the exhortation that Moses is giving to the people. Now, it may seem a little bit odd to us that the call to faith should be expressed by the word fear. What does fear have to do with faith? Now, as a matter of fact, fear made a lot of sense as a word for faith in the context of Deuteronomy, but I also think it made a lot of sense for the Apostle Paul. I ponder many times the words of the Apostle as we find them in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through 20, where Paul says this, The wrath of God from heaven is revealed against all ungodliness and human unrighteousness, because they hold the truth in disobedience. Because knowing God, they did not acknowledge him as God. Now, that has always made me wonder, why is it that God is justified in his anger at the fact that his presence is not recognized? And how is it that Paul can say they knew God because he has been revealed to them? In fact, he says something more than that. He says the invisible nature of God is clearly seen. I always find that kind of interesting. It's invisible, but it's clearly seen. I have to check what Dr. Porter said about that in his commentary. I forgot to do that for this sermon, but in any case, I find that a striking juxtaposition. It's invisible, but you can see it. Unmistakably, you can see it, so that you are without excuse. They have become empty and vain in their thinking. Now, how is it that we should be able to see the invisible things of God through the things that have been made? Well, I got a little reminder of that again Through reading newspapers, I know you're going to tell me that I shouldn't be spending my valuable short time that is left reading newspapers, but I do it. And every once in a while, I turn up something that actually interests me and may even believe. In this case, it had to do with a Yale professor. His name is Gelernter. He made the news because he wrote a review of a book in a Claremont paper. The review was entitled Denying Darwin. And the book he was reviewing was this one by Stephen Meyer, which is called Darwin's Doubt. After I read this little column in the paper, I thought I should at least see this book by Stephen Meyer. McMaster University does not consider its shelves to be worthy of this tome, and so I interlibrary loaned it. And when I got it, I decided that it was much too big to read in time for the talk which I was going to be given today. So I did the next best thing, and I watched the movie. You can find the movie on something called the Hoover Institute. They have a edition there that is moderated by Peter Robinson, in which he was actually interviewing David Gelernter, a philosopher named David Berlinski, and Stephen Meyer, all three of whom are adamant that the case which Darwin made for natural evolution is simply, factually, utterly impossible. It couldn't ever happen. Stephen Meyer in the book does start out with a famous paleontologist at the time named Agassiz, who said, this Cambrian period, all these forms of life that spontaneously show up in the Cambrian period, how could that happen in that space of time, which they called 70 million years, it's even shortened since then, by what you call mutation, spontaneous, and natural selection? Well, Darwin had serious problems with that himself back at that time, but it became much, much worse with the analysis of DNA, the understanding of amino acids, and the way in which this governs every single living form. That essentially is the topic of Gelernter's review, which I did read, in which he points out the astronomical impossibility mathematically of anything like this taking place during that time. Now, here's what Gelernter commented in the review concerning the responses to, in the interview, concerning his responses to the book. Their intellectual behavior, speaking now about the universities, and what they have published, and much more importantly, what they tell their students, has indeed passed beyond scientific argument as far as they are concerned. You take your life in your hands to challenge it intellectually. They will destroy you if you challenge it. Now, I haven't been destroyed. I'm not a biologist, and I don't claim to be an authority on the topic, but I have seen in their behavior intellectually at colleges across the West nothing approaching free speech. It is bitter, fundamental, angry, outraged rejection which comes nowhere near scientific discussion. I've seen it happen again and again. I am attacking their religion, and I don't blame them for being all head up. It's a big issue to them. That's Paul and Romans. The wrath of God is revealed against this stubborn denial because his invisible nature, intelligent design, if you want to call it that, is undeniable. It is everywhere. And yet, it is stubbornly, adamantly denied. Moses calls for fear. Think about that. Think about what you see. Think about who you are. And your response should be, love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your emotion. He is the maker of the heaven of heavens and all of the worlds. And he is the one who is to be recognized not just because of the intelligent design that you may see, but in particular because of what you have observed in his actions. God chose to create a people. He found Abraham, and he drew close to Abraham. And he chose Abraham, and out of Abraham made this people, which he is redeeming. It's not sufficient to just believe in the concept of intelligent design, but there's more than that. Faith is to believe in particular what God is doing in the world to redeem. Clearly, Moses has in mind Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. In you, all the nations of the world shall be blessed. Now, what we learn is something about faith. Because we come to Genesis 15 and there's no family whatever, not even one single child. And Abraham's got some questions about all of this. And God says, go outside, look at the stars. And that's how your family is going to be. And Abraham says, if you say so. Now, was he being rational? Was there anything sensible about Abraham's response? Well, Paul thinks so in Romans chapter 4. I ponder these words too, also, very often. Abraham gave some thought to this. The deadness of his body at 100 years old. I'm 70 years old and is pretty well nearly dead, and I don't know what he was feeling at 100, but it wasn't like he was going to become a father. I'm pretty sure of that. And he considered and thought carefully about the deadness of Sarah's womb. Now understand that too. No husband ever forgets that era of the hot flashes. And Abraham knew that those were long, long in the past. That was all over. But that didn't matter. Because if God had made the worlds, and if God had given life, what was this? That's a small thing. And if God has said that's what he's going to do, this wasn't Abraham's planning. It wasn't his choice. It wasn't his demand. This is what God is going to do. Then this is what constitutes faith. And so, God begins to create. And God gives a sign of the covenant. And the sign is called circumcision. So Moses moves here towards this sign of the faith and says, as we read it here, therefore circumcise your minds and stop being stubborn. Now, about half of you here have probably always thought that circumcision had no relevance to you, but I want to assure you that you're wrong. In fact, in Deuteronomy 30 and in Jeremiah 44, God is going to circumcise everyone. What is this? It's a striking metonymy where the sign comes to be named for the thing itself. What is circumcision? It is nothing more than faith and nothing less than faith in this covenant that God has made with his people concerning his redemption, the life-giving power that he is going to manifest. Should we really say mind? Well, I'm going to argue we should say mind because it was quite evidently understood that way in later time. I hold here Sarach, the rule of the community found at Qumran. In column 5, this column right here, are all the rules for the community. And what do they require? Well, they require repentance. They require that you turn. They require that you have humility. They require that you listen to the instruction of the Zadokite priests. Those are the right priests. And right here in line 5, it says, now you've got to turn away from the desires of your eyes, and you have to circumcise within the Yechad, the Yetzer, the mind, the thoughts, the desires, the impulses, because that's where commitments are made. That's where it all happens. And of course, I've often thought about the words of Jesus in the book of Mark. After all of the questions were being asked by the Sadducees and everyone else, someone comes along and says, well, Master, he's well educated in the Bible, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your kardia, that's lev, with all your psuke, that's nefesh, with all your iskus, that's ma'od, your strength, your wealth, and with all your dianaya, your mind. Where did that come from? Well, sometimes what interpreters have to do is, what the translators have to do is interpret. And there's no Greek-speaking person who would ever associate kardia with nous, because they had a whole different word for mind, and yet they knew perfectly well that lev meant mind. So you throw it in, an extra term there. I always thought Mark didn't know how to translate, but I came to find out that he's just an actually extraordinarily good translator. So what is it all about? Faith has to do with reason. It has to do with your thought. It has to do with your commitment. Your commitment in particular to this God. And what does that then entail concerning your life and concerning your work? It entails something quite simple. It means you do the kind of work that God does. And what does God do? Well, his first great concern is to care for especially the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans. And his concern is to care for the alienated, the ger, the stranger. That's God's whole concern. That's his business. And so then, what is God asking for these Israelites? Well, if they're going to love him, what they need to do is to care for the sojourner, because they were sojourners in the land of Egypt. They should know something about being a foreigner. The Israelites and the Canaanites are a constant antithesis. That's a real problem within the covenant. There's two kinds of relationships with the Canaanites. One kind of Canaanite is a servant to the Israelites. He lives within their territory. He's among them. He might be like the Gibeonite, hewer of wood and carrier of water. He has no land. He's very dependent. He's the ger. He's the sojourner. And then there's the other kind of Canaanite. The other kind of Canaanite is wealthy and prosperous and serves Baal and has all sorts of power. And both are a constant challenge. The second, because of course the Israelites are constantly led away from fearing God to looking at the Canaanite and seeing what the Canaanite has and thinking somehow that Baal must have something for them that they aren't getting with what they have. Moses has constant warnings about that. It's interesting to me that in Deuteronomy 8, Moses says, that's a danger when you're poor, and that's a danger when you're rich. Because when you're poor, you feel like God isn't caring for you, and you want to look somewhere else for some help. And when you're rich, you think, oh, this is all the great things I can do for myself, and I don't need to trust God. Both are a great danger to the Israelite. So Moses warns them. Fear. But the other side of it is that they must make sure that they are doing what God does in caring for the widow and caring for the orphan. Moses gives a summary here right at the end. What does the Lord your God ask? He asks for your fear. He asks that you serve him and abide by him. And he asks that you swear by his name. Now, if I may give a little exposition to those three items, I think in many words here, in many ways here, you have precisely a condensation of the 10 words themselves. The 10 words which are the covenant. The first words have to do with the person of God, who he is. The one who has no rivals because he is holy. He stands outside of all of creation. He is the source of all life. He is unlike any other God. All other powers are somehow derivative of creation. Fear him. Serve him. And of course, there you have the ways in which we have to hold key values. Those key values are human life itself. You shall not kill. Family. You shall honor father and mother, and you shall not commit adultery. And property, you shall not steal. And this is your work. This is the work of faith. This is what we are constantly called to do. And then finally, and most importantly perhaps, our speech. Oaths. You shall not bear false witness. When you take the name of the Lord, you are taking your life in your hands. And what you say needs to be true. And so Moses here issues this call to faith and the work that invariably must be the result of understanding true faith in God. Ending with this doxology, God is our praise. We have seen his great and awesome deeds. 70 went down to Egypt, and a great multitude came out. Redemption has only begun. All of this, of course, begins with right thinking. That interview with Robinson ended on the whole question of the mind. And Robinson quoted C.S. Lewis. This is a little quote that comes from his book on miracles, in which Lewis talks about the mind, intellect, and thinking. And this is the quote that he gave to Galanter, who has done quite a bit of stuff on mind and computers and all that sort of thing, Bienkowski, the philosopher, and the Stephen Myers. All possible knowledge, then, depends on the validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty which we express by words like must be, and therefore, and since, is a real perception of how things outside our own minds really must be, well and good. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds and not a genuine insight into realities beyond them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we can have no knowledge. And unless human reasoning is valid, you can't even do any science. No science is possible. That was an interesting discussion because Bienkowski became David Hume, just the absolute agnostic, denying anything about possibility of knowledge. Galanter was just not at all willing to accept the fact that the logical extension of this intelligence comes from the one who grants life to all things. Stephen Meyer, of course, wanted to point much more in that direction. But it reminds us of how critical this is. Here we are, these years, exercising our minds. That's a good thing. You couldn't have made a better choice. It's going to be worth every penny you have spent. And I know you're spending a few of them. I was visiting with a relative student just this weekend. Every time we talked about the cost of his education, he got this look from his wife about who is paying for this and how much it costs. But let me assure you, it's worth it. Your mind is about your faith and your work. Listen to the Apostle Paul. Put away that former conduct, that old person that's deceived according to lust. Put on the new mind, new thinking in the Spirit of God, created after God in righteousness and true holiness. That's our faith. That's our work. It can't be summarized better than that. It's our thinking. And you're never done with thinking. You're never done with learning. That's a present tense when Paul says, put on the new mind. That's every day. Every day it's learning again this particular capacity that God has given us in order that we may understand our faith and in order that may we understand our work, O Lord. Today, renew our minds after righteousness and true holiness, we pray.